Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years, and in that time, he became something close to a national institution. A man so unshakably composed behind that famous desk that audiences started believing he was simply immune to chaos. But live television has never cared about reputations, and what happened on that stage when things went genuinely wrong turned out to be just as legendary as everything that went right. These are the most heated moments in Tonight Show history, and every single one of them was completely real. Charles Grodin walked onto that couch not to promote anything or charm anyone, but to do something far more unsettling, which was to ask Johnny Carson whether he actually cared about the people he interviewed. Not as a joke, not as a bit. Grodin pressed that question with the patience and precision of someone who had been sharpening it for years, and Carson, rather than deflecting with a laugh, told the truth in a way that caught everyone off guard. He needed warm bodies, he explained, an hour to fill every night, and 7 good minutes from a guest got him home to Malibu happy. The audience assumed this was performance. Grodin treated it as confession, and that's when the segment went somewhere a talk show almost never goes. Carson started defending himself in earnest, talking about the human condition, about genuinely caring, and Grodin responded with a single word delivered so precisely it cut through everything. "Deeply?" he said, leaning forward, making it sound less like a question and more like an accusation. What nobody expected was that the tension would simply stay there, unresolved, 2 men at genuine odds, with no rescue joke arriving to signal that the game was over. The segment ended without a pivot, without a laugh that cleared the air, and the audience sat with something they couldn't quite name. Dorothy Fuldheim and Richard Pryor landed on opposite ends of the same couch and immediately revealed that they had almost nothing in common in terms of how they understood the country they both lived in. Fuldheim, a pioneering television journalist with decades of experience and deeply held opinions, stated with full confidence that nobody in America truly had to go without, that starvation and homelessness were problems with available solutions that people simply needed to access. Pryor listened to this with the stillness of someone who grew up knowing exactly how wrong that picture was, and when he responded, he didn't reach for a punchline. People lived on the streets right now, he said, not as abstraction but as present tense fact, and Fuldheim pushed back by insisting they didn't have to. What followed was Pryor refusing, with remarkable calm, to let that framing stand. He mentioned Appalachia as a reference point, tried to build a bridge between their experiences, but Fuldheim held her position, and Pryor held his, and Carson sat between them, trying to moderate something that had long since outgrown. First, the format. The laughs stopped entirely, which almost never happened on that show, and the studio went quiet in a way that felt earned rather than awkward. Pryor wasn't performing. He was a man saying true things in a place designed for entertainment, and the friction between those two realities filled every inch of the room. Richard Pryor and Chevy Chase sharing that couch should have produced easy, high-energy comedy banter between 2 of the sharpest performers of their generation, and for a few minutes it almost did. Except that underneath every exchange ran a current of genuine competition that kept sharpening the edges of everything they said. Chase arrived with the ease of someone who had become famous fast and wore it lightly, and Pryor arrived with the intensity of someone who had earned every inch of his reputation through years of work that was personally costly and genuinely dangerous. The compliments started arriving early, and each one landed with a slight twist, the kind of praise that doubles as a reminder of hierarchy. Chase found a way to call Pryor's recent work funny while making clear his own was funnier, and Pryor's response cut straight through the diplomatic wrapping. He said he didn't like Chevy, plainly, without softening it or walking it back, dropping it into the middle of the segment like something heavy onto a glass table. Chase tried to recover with wit, and Pryor met every recovery with something sharper, and Carson watched the whole thing with the expression of a man who brought 2 people together for a conversation and ended up refereeing something else entirely. The audience kept laughing because the lines were genuinely funny, but the laughter had a breathless quality to it. That particular sound of people laughing while also bracing for whatever comes next. Orson Welles and Robert Blake arriving on the same stage meant two men who had never in their lives found it easy to yield to anyone, suddenly needing to share one couch, and neither of them had any intention of making that comfortable. Welles carried the particular authority of someone who directed Citizen Kane at 25 and had spent decades since then navigating the complicated relationship between a towering early achievement and everything that came after it. Blake carried the coiled energy of someone who fought for everything he had and extended no automatic deference to legends he hadn't personally verified. When Welles threw the first sharp line about Blake's appearance, the return came immediately and with equal force, and that's when the segment stopped being a conversation and became something closer to a territorial negotiation. The jokes had teeth. The compliments arrived preloaded with barbs. Carson watched with the focused calm of someone observing something genuinely unpredictable, choosing not to intervene too aggressively, because what was happening was, in its own strange way, riveting. Neither man gave ground. Neither man offered anything resembling warmth as the segment closed. They had apparently established what they needed to establish, and they parted without ceremony, leaving the studio with the charged atmosphere of a room where something has just been decided and nobody can quite say what. Lyndon Smith created a completely different kind of discomfort, the kind that doesn't come from aggression or ego, but from a cheerful, absolute inability to recognize that a conversation has somewhere it needs to go. Smith was a pediatrician with strong opinions about children's health and essentially no awareness of the invisible architecture that governs how talk show segments are supposed to work. He arrived on the Tonight Show couch and began talking, and then he kept talking through every signal Carson sent, through every slight shift in posture, every angled redirect, every micro-expression that any experienced guest would have read immediately as an invitation to land the plane. He talked about cough syrup made from bourbon and antihistamines and molasses. He talked about children barking by the bed at night. He talked about lemon juice and ice in Portland, Oregon, and then he looped back and talked about some of it again. Carson's patience moved through visible stages, from professional warmth to pointed engagement to increasingly direct attempts at steering to something that looked, for a man famous for his composure, remarkably close to open frustration. The audience laughed, but their laughter had burst. The sympathetic quality of people watching someone endure something they're relieved isn't happening to them. Smith never noticed any of it, just kept talking with the enthusiasm of someone having the best conversation of his week, utterly impervious to the fact that the host of the show had been trying to end that conversation for what felt like a very long time. March 18th, 1981, brought an argument between Carson and Ed McMahon that was strange precisely because of how ordinary its subject was and how extraordinary its context. These two men had sat side by side for decades, had built a professional partnership so smooth and so reliable that audiences thought of them almost as a single unit. And now they were visibly, genuinely arguing on live television about whether a bird spending 3 years continuously airborne was really comparable to a shark that never stops swimming. MC Man held his position. Carson refuted it with increasing firmness, walking through the physics of water versus air buoyancy in a way that suggested he found the comparison not just wrong, but almost personally offensive. Neither man conceded, and what made the moment so unsettling wasn't the argument itself, but the texture of it, the way it felt like something that had happened before in private and was now surfacing where millions of people could see it. Carson made a joke and pivoted, but the edge stayed in the air for the rest of the segment, and MC Man sat with the particular stiffness of someone who believes he was right and remains unsatisfied. The audience laughed but kept going quiet too quickly, the rhythm of the show stumbling just slightly before recovering, enough to remind everyone watching that even the steadiest professional partnerships have pressure points, and live television has a talent for finding them. Betty White and Joan Rivers meeting on that couch should have been a celebration. Two women who had built careers against considerable odds, sharing an easy and warm conversation for a late-night audience. What actually happened was faster and sharper, and considerably more electric than that. Rivers moved at her usual speed, which meant jokes arrived before the previous one had fully landed, and her targets included White's outfit, her cover appearances, and the relative prestige of her recent publications. White met all of this with something that surprised the room, not the gentle, universally beloved persona she had spent decades cultivating, but a sharper version of herself that emerged specifically in response to being pushed. The lines got more pointed as the segment went on, the digs landing closer to the bone with each exchange, and the audience laughter grew louder and slightly more breathless, the way laughing feels when you sense real stakes underneath a performance. Carson tried to steer the conversation elsewhere at least twice, and both times one of the women said something that made steering impossible because it demanded a first response and got one immediately. Neither would let the other have the last word, which meant the segment kept running past the point where it would normally have wrapped, escalating in a way that made it hard to look away. By the time it finally ended, the audience applauded with the particular energy of people who witnessed something they didn't expect and aren't entirely sure how to categorize. The May 15th, 1963 appearance of Marlon Brando and Zsa Zsa Gabor is the Tonight Show moment that lives almost entirely in legend now, partly because the accounts from people who were there are so vivid, and partly because the footage itself has essentially ceased to exist. Brando arrived at the studio that night in rough shape, disheveled and unfocused in ways that people who were present described clearly in the years that followed, clearly not in any condition that would have cleared a pre-show checklist had anyone enforced one. Gabor arrived expecting the kind of evening she knew well, charming and flirtatious, delivering quotable lines about husbands and diamonds to a friendly audience. What she got instead was Brando in whatever state Brando was in that night, and the resulting exchange deteriorated from awkward to hostile with uncomfortable speed. Gabor eventually left the couch under circumstances that witnesses described in ways ranging from a dignified exit to something considerably closer to storming off, leaving dead air in her wake.
And here's the thing that makes this
First moment stranger than all the others, which is that the tape no longer exists, and persistent accounts suggest that absence was not accidental. The story handed down through people who were there holds that producers made a deliberate decision not to preserve that particular evening, a choice made specifically because of what happened on camera. Carson later referred to it as a great interview, which, given everything reportedly involved, was either a masterpiece of understatement or the most diplomatic sentence ever spoken about a television disaster. April 1977 brought the strangest and most quietly troubling moment in all of these, and it came not from a volatile guest or a celebrity collision, but from Ed MC Mann, the man who had sat reliably to Carson's left for years and whose entire job was to make everything run more smoothly. MC Mann appeared that evening in a state that concerned people in the studio from his first few sentences, his speech carrying a quality that wasn't quite right, his thoughts looping back on themselves without reaching conclusions, his focus drifting in ways that were visible to anyone watching. He talked about Joan Embry and the animals at the wild animal park. He insisted he was the only one who had gone down to visit, looping back to that point more than once, as though the first time hadn't registered. At several moments, he looked directly into the camera and held that look for stretches of time that felt, for viewers at home, uncomfortably long. First, Carson worked to help him, throwing gentle setups MC Mann could have used to stabilize, offering redirects framed as jokes, suggesting at one point that a small nap might help, and none of it quite landed the way it normally would between two people who had shared a stage for so long. The silences between their exchanges carried a weight that was entirely different from the comfortable pauses of two men who know each other well, these silences feeling worried in a way that the audience picked up on, their laughter trailing off too quickly, uncertain whether laughing was the right response. By the end of that segment, Carson had the posture of someone doing two things at once, fulfilling his professional obligations, while also, quietly, trying to protect someone he had worked beside for years, from a moment that might otherwise define him. It was uncomfortable in the deepest possible sense, not because anyone said something cruel or threw a punch, but because something human and unguarded was visible on camera in a format that had no container for it. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years, And across those 30 years, he navigated thousands of conversations with a skill that has never been fully replicated by anyone who came after him. He could create the conditions for something good. He could steer and redirect and absorb and recover with a grace that looked from the outside like it required no effort at all. None of that could make Grodin cooperate, or, first, make Pryor soften what he knew to be true, or make Brando arrive in a condition suitable for television, or make MC Man perform at his best on a night when his best simply wasn't available. The live format stripped away every layer of protection and left the truth sitting there on camera, which turned out to be this. Even the most polished and controlled hour of television ever produced was always, underneath everything, just a group of human beings in a room together, subject to every unpredictable thing that implies. The moments when that truth showed through most clearly, when the format cracked and something real came through, are the ones that people still talk about decades later. Not because they were easy to watch, but because they were, in the most fundamental sense, honest. And honesty, even when it's messy, and nobody involved knows quite what to do with it, has a way of staying with you long after the comfortable moments have faded completely.